I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly. Selwa from Costa Rica. Welcome. Natalie from CSUN. Yay. All right. And okay. Are we a go for recording or shall I wait a little bit more? We're a go. All right, we are a go. So good afternoon and welcome to the Sustainability and Air Pollution webinar. Fun fact, the entire month of October is Sustainability Month and today is Sustainability Day. So welcome. Thank you for joining us on this special occasion. My name is Amanda Perez and I am one out of 6 students in Sustainability 401. And we've partnered with the Institute for Sustainability to bring you this webinar. Now I'm going to share my screen real quick and show you our crowning achievement. So here, as you can see, we partnered with, my goodness gracious, I am so sorry. Let me stop sharing one more time. Oh, a live webinar, anything could happen. So yes, so as you can see, I'll put up the picture a little bit later. That picture was part of the Clean Air Pledges with the help from CSUN's Institute for Sustainability, Environmental and Occupational Health Students Association, and our Applied Sustainability class. Cal State University Northridge was ranked number 5 out of 650 organizational partners who took the Clean Air Pledge with 783 pledges. We hope that next year we would be able to reach 1,000 or even more. And today we do have a representative from the organization behind Clean Air Day. But before we get to our amazing panelists, I'll hand the mic over to Kimberly Durden to explain more about the Institute for Sustainability.
Thank you, Amanda. So hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Durden, and I'm a current CSUN student. I also work for the Institute for Sustainability as their outreach student assistant. And so I'll just talk a little bit more about what the Institute has to offer. And so we focus on operations and infrastructure of sustainability at CSUN. And so we do have a zero waste plan that we've been implementing, and our goal is by 2025, and we have all that information on our website. The Institute also focuses on education, outreach, and research opportunities for students. And so some of our educational aspects is like this webinar, Sustainability Day during Sustainability Month. And so we focus a lot on collaborations with students, with organizations on and off campus. And we also host volunteering opportunities for them as well. And so another thing that we do offer is volunteering at our food garden. This is where students are able to complete their service learning hours for specific classes. The food garden that we have also replenishes the food pantry, the fresh produce for the food pantry. Another thing that we promote is the sustainability minor and the newly formed master's sustainability master's program. So if you're interested in learning more about any of these things that we do offer, you can go ahead and look into our website. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Nat. It's in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Stabe. I'm a part of the SUS 401 group putting on this event. And so we'll get started in a minute in asking questions to our panelists. We have 4 panelists from different organizations, and I'd like to take a minute to introduce all of them. And so first off, we have Chris Chavez from Coalition for Clean Air. That is the organization that we partnered with that put on Clean Air Day. And so Chris joined the Coalition for Clean Air in 2017 and works on local and state advocacy, disadvantaged communities, and electric vehicle development. Previously, Chris served as a legislative aide for State Senator Fran Pavley, staffing her on transportation, the state budget, and the Senate floor. Additionally, Chris served as a Senate fellow for then Senator Alex Padilla and staffed legislation that improved rail service in Southern California. Prior to his time at the Capitol, Chris was a student advocate for California's public higher education system. Chris has a bachelor's in political science from California State University, Long Beach, and is an active member of the Long Beach community. Thanks for coming, Chris. And next we have Rogelio Pardo. Regelio Pardo brings a commitment to serving communities and a diverse transportation planning background with experience in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. Serving as a program director, he works with Urban Movement Labs partners to guide pilot projects and identify metrics to ensure lessons learned to inform policy and regulations in a way that facilitates the adoption of mobility services more efficiently and brings benefits to community members. Rogelio looks forward to applying his transportation policy and design, strategic planning, and community engagement experience to foster partnerships between community members, public agencies, and private partners that bring meaningful mobility solutions to Los Angeles. Next, we have Uyen-Uyen Vote. So Uyen-Uyen is from the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Uyen-Uyen is a program supervisor for the Office of Planning, Rural Development, and Area Sources at the South Coast AQMD, developing rules to support the reclaim transition and address toxic air contaminants. Uyen-Uyen is currently working on new source review and nitrous oxide emission reduction rules. Previously, Uyen-Uyen worked for South Coast AQMD's Office of Science and Technology Advancement as an air quality chemist. Uyen-Uyen earned her bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of San Diego, 2005. And lastly, we have David Diaz from Pacoima Beautiful. David Diaz is a recent graduate from CSUN with a degree in environmental and occupational health with a minor in GIS. David has deep passions in environmental research and community engagement. Through his work at CSUN, he was able to partner with UTEP to investigate spatial distribution of air pollutants in Northeast San Fernando Valley. It was through this research that David discovered his passion for youth engagement in research-related projects. Today, David is passionate about engaging youth in policy and creating programming that will help develop future young leaders. Thank you, all of our panelists, for joining us today. I think this is going to be a great opportunity for all of you to learn about these organizations and learn a lot about air pollution and hopefully inspire some action within you. And so just a general rule, I know everybody's been good, but just to keep your mics on mute, please. If you would like to have your camera on, that's totally optional, up to you. This event is being recorded. But we're just going to jump right into questions. And we have a few individual questions and just a chance to get to know all of our speakers a little bit more. We're going to be starting off with Chris Chavez from Coalition for Clean Air. So Chris, spotlight's on you. What do you view as the biggest problem when it comes to air pollution and why?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is really understanding and addressing the enormity of the challenge we face. So over the last 30 years, 30, 40 years, air pollution has improved significantly. You know, for the folks that were around back in the 80s, back in the 70s, remember that air pollution was very, very bad back then. However, what's important to remember, what's important to know, is that our air still does not meet federal air quality standards. So in other words, our air is so dirty, it's illegal. That's particularly true for ozone, which becomes smog. The LA, Long Beach region, so Southern California, the #1 air pollutant in our region is smog. I'd also suggest another major challenge that we are dealing with here is what's known as diesel particulate matter. And diesel particulate matter is a known carcinogen. It's actually comprised of about 40 different carcinogenic compounds. And it is the primary air toxic contaminant, the primary air pollution cancer driver in Southern California and California as a whole. It also disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color, including the one I live in, which I'm on the western side of Long Beach. We're dealing with the 710 freeway, the ports, the rail yards, etc. And all those things have cumulative impacts that impact the health, the quality of life, and really the longevity of people who live in these communities.
Thank you, Chris. Sounds like a problem, and a problem that affects our health.
And that's before you start even getting into climate issues, which is a little bit of a broader scope that we could be a whole panel discussion on just on that alone.
Absolutely. And we have questions about that later as well. Next question is for Rogelio. So how can better transportation planning improve air quality, Rogelio?
Sure. I think a lot of it is what are the choices that we have on hand, right? I believe that today in California, the transportation sector has or is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And that goes beyond just the passenger vehicles that are packing the freeways. It includes everything associated with freight and good movement, which I think Chris is going to speak to a lot, the activity at the ports, getting things from the ports into our distribution centers on the inland, in the inland empire and throughout the region, as well as getting things to people's doors. So really, transportation is a big piece of the puzzle of how do we solve air pollution issues and mobility issues at large. There's been a lot of talk in recent days and recent weeks, months, since the election really on the electrification of our transportation system. And while that will certainly make help improve things and will kind of rid us from the tailpipe emissions, generating that energy has to come from somewhere, and most energy sources are not particularly clean with our current investment in renewables. So really we need to think about how do we change our mobility system to create different options for people. Yes, the car is a big, long-standing component of life in Los Angeles. It likely will continue to be a key component in Los Angeles, especially in a region that is so spread out. But how do we reduce how many vehicle miles people need to drive to do their day-to-day destinations? How can we make it an inviting environment for people to walk to the grocery store? I think it very quickly we open up Pandora's box of topics like land use and transportation are very close to one another. And I think one last thing I'll think about I want to mention is just how different technologies work and how we reimagine mobility systems. So right now, I think Nathan, you mentioned how freight activity has just skyrocketed over the last year as people are ordering more and more things to the door, meaning that we have more freight running through people's neighborhoods, bringing more emissions closer to their doorstep. But how do we reimagine that? What are different mobility tools, mobility options? And that's something I'm working with Urban Movement Labs a lot on, which is like bringing new technologies to kind of solve that first last mile, not just for individual trips, but also for freight trips. So those are a couple things, and I look forward to diving into it a little bit further later with y'all.
Absolutely, thank you. Transportation sector is a big contributor, for sure. Win-win. So as a representative for a local air quality district, so concerning our air district, should we be concerned about our local air quality, and what steps are you and your colleagues taking to improve it?
Okay, thanks for that question, Nathan. So I do want to start with, we have improved our air quality, despite that, our population has grown, the number of vehicles on the road are increasing, and, LA is, the largest manufacturing hub in the United States. I think one large sign that shows our improved air quality is that we have essentially eliminated stage 1 and stage 2 smog alerts. I think another great example to look at is, since the 1950s, our maximum level of ozones have been cut to 1/4. This is taking into consideration the fact that our population has tripled. We have 4 times as many vehicles on the road. And like I said, LA continues to be the largest manufacturing hub in the United States. So this is, talking about ozone. Now, local toxics is also an issue for our district. And then, South Coast AQMD has conducted several toxic exposure studies. And these studies have actually shown that there's been a 60% drop of carcinogenic risk from 2004 to 2012. And these are great successes and, something that is really good for our region. But, it is true, our region still faces a lot of public health effects from the air quality. Some health effects include asthma attacks, lung and heart disease, reproductive and neurological effects, even some types of cancer and premature death. So yes, once again, there has been an improvement in our quality, but there a lot of work needs to be done. Rogelio and Chris both spoke to it. Chris mentioned we are not in federal attainment for some public health standards. That's for ozone and particulate matter. To get these numbers down to the standards at the appropriate deadlines, within the next 7 to 15 years, we have to substantially decrease our nitrogen oxide emissions. And then, with local air quality, as toxic air contaminants continue to be an issue, we do need additional toxic measures in order to further reduce these toxic emissions and then lower the health and cancer risk levels that come with that.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll definitely get into more about the public health effects and about groups who are at risk as well. And so, thank you, Uyen-Uyen. Next question is for David. David, as you represent Pacoima Beautiful, I know Pacoima Beautiful does a lot of work involved in environmental justice. So how is air pollution an environmental justice issue? And tell us about the environmental justice aspects of the air pollution problem.
Yeah, so when we think about air pollution, one key factor is that we know it travels, right? But in communities like ours, like in the Northeast, San Fernando Valley, there's a lot of like concentration of air pollutants in that area. And we think why? And most of the time, our communities, low-income communities or communities of color, don't have the necessary resources to fight back against, industries coming and setting up shop and polluting our environment. And so as a result, from generations of this happening, we kind of become nose blind to it. And we're like, well, that factory's always been there. It's just something that we kind of grew up with, right? And the way that air pollution kind of gets exacerbated in these areas is that we don't notice them, right? They're right in front of us, but we don't really acknowledge them. And so air pollution and environmental justice is deeply connected to systemic racism that's been happening in LA and across the state or across California, right? We think about how the state was formed and how we stole land and how we kind of kick people out of their land and really who was this land made for? And so what we're trying to do is really educate the youth and educate our community that we can stand up, right? We can fight for a clean environment. It doesn't matter, right, our income status. We all deserve the right to breathe clean air. And so that's how air pollution is an environmental justice issue. And it may seem scary to a lot of people, right, in our community, our youth fighting against these really big like institutions saying, well, that's an airport. We can't, transform that into a clean space, or we can't fight for these green spaces, but we can. And something that we tell all our community members and our youth is that you're experts of your own experience. And so, I really like that because it really puts things into perspective that you don't need to have this huge degree to like know that your experiences are valid and that your stories deserve respect. And so that's kind of how air pollution is tied to environmental justice, just deeply rooted in environmental racism and generations of racism that's been happening in communities like the Northeast Valley. Some of the work that we've been doing as Pacoima Beautiful is just going out into the community and building community resilience. I think that is so important when we're talking about environmental justice, right? Building this resilience so that when, let's say in 50 years, God knows where we're at, we have a community to support us and stand up for when the next industry tries to come and pollute our area. We can have that network to be like, no, you're not polluting our community anymore. And so we've been on the ground doing outreach events, trying to get people engaged in their community and knowing that, it's not lame to care about your environment. It's really great. And so part of the youth aspect, we really want to encourage youth to know that really anything's possible and that they can really advocate for their environment. And so it's been great. We have a lot of passionate, really bright youth that are part of our coalition. And it's just amazing to see that our future is really changing and knowing that it's with our youth. So yeah, I'm happy to be here and happy to answer more questions on that.
I love that, David. I think it's great what you're doing with youth, because that's where change starts. Is, you know, with the next generation coming up, we're the ones who are gonna have to live with and deal with all these problems. And I think it's great, as you, just a recent graduate, and just the work that you're doing with youth and inspiring that. And I think, would you say that youth, this next generation coming up, are we inspired, or are we, you know, how has your experience been working with the local youth?
Oh my gosh, these youth, they have such a special place in my heart. They're more than inspiring. They're driving change already at such young ages. It's beautiful to see it, really. And I have such great hopes and dreams for the future, because I know that we're in really good hands, knowing that they're taking lead, and knowing that from their experiences they can grow and say, hey, no, like when they get into positions of like higher power, they'll be like, I remember my community. I remember what it was like to live next to a factory, next to an airport, next to a freeway, busy streets, and knowing that they have the power to make that change, and they're starting to realize that their power is limitless. And yeah, so they get me super inspired. I can talk about like them for days, hours, I don't know, but I'm really hopeful for the future. We're in really great hands.
Awesome. It's good to hear. So we have a list of open-ended questions for all of our panelists. Anybody can jump in. And we talked a little bit about a lot of these things, but this is a chance to really go into detail and just kind of piggyback on one another and get some real conversation going. And so what are the public health concerns of air pollution? Maybe you want to talk about some specific pollutants a little bit more and the effect on human health, and maybe some at-risk groups too.
I'm going to volunteer to kick things off here. And I think Chris and David and Uyen-Uyen probably have a lot more to add. But I think when I was first starting my career, there was a document that came out. It was called the LA Health Atlas. And what that atlas showed were kind of the different impacts of different factors in the community of Los Angeles. And I think the most striking factor was exposure to particulate matter and pollution that came from diesel trucks. And as you might imagine, the concentration and the communities that were most heavily impacted were along the 110 corridor, the 710 corridor, the 5 communities up in Pacoima, communities that are often ignored and overlooked when it comes to planning processes. As David was mentioning, you know, there's a reason it's a lot of work to help these communities find their voice, because they're communities that have historically not been given that power, that authority, or even asked about changes in their community, right? So what I'm diverting, so back to that document, these communities that had the highest levels of exposure to pollutants were also had incredibly high risk for cardiovascular diseases, asthma, life expectancy were as much as 15 years less than communities where they weren't exposed to these emissions. So someone in South LA would expect to live 15 years less than someone in Beverly Hills. And that for me just kind of really struck a chord. Like how absurd is it that your zip code or the block that you are born into can really impact your life in such a staggering and scaffolding way. So I think one of the biggest centerpieces to talking about transportation or air pollution and emissions in general really has to be, where are those impacts most felt, and how are we working to, one, reduce the negative impacts that have been placed and burdened on these communities unfairly, and how do we make sure that they're the communities that are prioritized in new approaches? Because I'll tell you what, right now where EV chargers are being installed isn't in those neighborhoods that are most impacted. And those are also not the communities that have access to Lime scooters like they do in Silver Lake or in downtown LA. So it really is a scaffolding and intersectional approach to air pollution, and that really brings together public health, mobility, sustainability, and climate change. So I think that one of the biggest concerns when it comes to air pollution is what are all the other factors that intersect with that, and where is equity, and how do we ensure that equity is front and center?
I definitely want to, piggyback on what Rogelio is saying. I think, we're looking at, we're talking a lot about mobile sources, right? We have our toxics that are coming from our stationary sources. And, all these do fold together to create not only a local air quality issue, but our toxics issue locally. And then, greenhouse gases and our climate change. So I think one thing that I think about, especially as the local air agency, we don't have that much jurisdiction over mobile sources. And then since all these topics do relate, and in particular, it affects our environmental justice communities, I think it's really important that, we work collaboratively with all our stakeholders, and, we fold in our state and our federal regulators and have a more cohesive plan to take care of the issues that we see impacting our local air quality.
And to Rogelio's point about taking into account all the other factors that affect people, I think that's a very salient point. And what that's oftentimes described as cumulative exposures or cumulative risk factors. So, the same communities that don't have access to clean air also struggle with access to housing. They struggle with access to healthcare. They struggle with access to gainful employment. So that they have all these unique challenges and facets that compound the effects of the pollution that they're being exposed to. And this is actually kind of personal for me as well, because I grew up in this neighborhood and I had asthma as a kid. My cousin, who grew up about a mile away from me, also had asthma. He actually grew up a little bit closer to the freeways than I did, and he still has to rely on a rescue inhaler. I've fortunately been able to avoid that. It's just that there are some huge impacts on people's quality of life, and kind of to a point that David was mentioning earlier. When you have a community that has long suffered from these impacts, these things just kind of become normalized. You have, it's just thought, well, kids get asthma, what can you do? Well, if you actually look at it, it's because they're being exposed to higher levels of pollution contributing to that asthma. I would also just really briefly say that the other kind of health effects I would point to is also, again, with the South Coast AQMD has a study called the Multiple Air Toxics Exposure Study that looks at relative cancer risk across the entire jurisdiction, and the risk is highest in communities near goods movement corridors. So we're talking 710, 91, 10 freeway, 60, all those areas. So really this corridor from the ports all the way up to East LA and then out to San Bernardino and the Inland Empire. And those are predominantly communities of color and low-income communities. And then again, they have multiple sources. So I would look at Wilmington, which is just across the flood control channel from me. And it's, they also contend with having the bulk of California's oil refining capacity in their backyard. And it should be no surprise that this was also a formerly redline community back in the 1930s. So all these things are compounding and dealing with other factors, other disadvantages that really have an impact on these people's lives. And you were mentioning, Rogelio, about the difference in lifespan. So in East Long Beach, the lifespan is about 6 to 8 years longer than it is in my zip code on the western side of the city. And that is something that you see repeated across the state, whether it's at the neighborhood level all the way into when you're looking at cities as well.
Just want to hop in here and piggyback off with what has been said already, and everyone said it so well, right? Especially when it concerning to environmentally impacted communities. I think one of the biggest issues that we have is that in a lot of our communities, there's not a lot of data that supports, what we're exposed to on a daily basis or how much pollution is there really. And so we just know that it's super polluted, right? And that's it. And so I think a big public health concern that isn't talked about a lot is just the mental health aspect of living in an environmentally polluted community. right? Access to green space or a place to just escape when you're like, okay, the factory's making those weird noises again, cars honking, where do I go? And you can't go anywhere. Mental health really is overlooked, I think, and we're all just kind of taught to be like, well, let's just be resilient. But how do you build resiliency when you don't have those access to green spaces or you know, an escape or a place to just look at and be like, wow, like my air is clean. And so I think that's another huge concern that often gets overlooked, but I think it's just as important, because how can we continue to build resiliency when we're not even in the right headspace or not taking care of ourselves or don't have the resources to even take care of ourselves? And I think that just propagates more environmental injustices that happen, right? Where you're like, well, I can't do anything, or I can't like fight against this. And so definitely, I think resiliency when it comes to mental health is a huge aspect of air pollution as well.
Thank you, all of our panelists who participated in this discussion. It's clearly a problem, and maybe it's gotten better, but problem hasn't gone away. And this is something that we're gonna have to live with and decide if we are gonna do something about it or not. And so we're thankful to all of you who are involved in this fight for our communities, because that's what it's about, because it's affecting our communities, it's affecting them negatively, is what I'm hearing. And so what is the link between air pollution and climate change?
I think in terms of the link between air pollution and climate change is that they are definitely interconnected, because on the one hand, you have them oftentimes generated. So climate damaging pollutants and health harming pollutants are oftentimes generated, or almost always generated together. So the same pollution that is affecting, that creates smog, oxides of nitrogen, things like that, are oftentimes co-pollutants to greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, etc. So they both are, or they are frequently from the same source. I would also suggest that the changing climate intensifies the effects of health harming pollutants. So you have things like extreme heat that is compounding the health effects of health harming air pollutants, and then also heat has a role in the creation of smog as well, because it's called photogenic smog. It's the full name of it, and that is due to the presence of sunlight and heat. And it causes a chemical reaction that results in smog. So they're definitely interconnected. They're definitely interrelated. And I know as in the advocacy side, when we're talking to state regulators, or we're talking to South Coast AQMD, we always ask them in their rules to maximize co-benefits. And what does that mean? That means that you maximize, if you're going to reduce greenhouse gases, you also need to maximize reductions of health harming pollutants as well, so that you're getting more bang for your buck out of these rules and regulations and these new pieces of pollution control technology.
And I think one thing, that I often think about when it comes to climate change and air pollution is how one issue is exacerbating the other issue, right? Like, for example, as the earth is warming, we have these droughts, with the droughts, then now we create an additional particulate matter problem for our region. Another thing that I heard was that, our hydro power plants are going to soon be obsolete because we don't have enough water to power them. And then, so then that relies now on back to our natural gas power plants, which then, is now adding to the air pollution and the climate change issue. So, in addition to the co-pollutant, the co-benefit issue, it's just a revolving cycle for me in my head. So, that's something that I try to consider when I'm looking at air pollution controls and what else can we do to take care of our issues, our local air quality issues.
What are the sources of air pollution we should be concerned about, and why?
I guess I can kick off this question. I think, right, for our district, for our basin, right, we talked about our inability right now to meet the federal standards for ozone and PM. So I think some of the statistics we were given is that, by 2023, we need to reduce NOx emissions by 45%, and then by 2031, an additional 55%. And as the district moves on with our NOx rules and sunsetting what we call a reclaim program, unfortunately, that's probably not going to be enough to get where we need to get to attain these federal standards. We've talked a lot about transportation, that accounts for 50% of the energy use in the basin. And, that leads to, the diesel particulate matter that Chris was mentioning. But once again, South Coast doesn't have jurisdiction over these vehicles. That's, state and federal. So I think, in terms of what we need to care about is, these NOx emissions coming from the transportation sector, how to get them, to be zero or near zero emissions.
I think also other sources of air pollution that we should be concerned about, just thinking about kind of like looking at my own community and Pacoima in general, is the ones that we don't really know that they're there, or the businesses that are running in backyards, right? Backyards have been converted into auto body shops where we're like, well, I didn't know that space was an auto body shop. Kind of like those invisible spaces that are just polluting our environment. And also like those really big industries, right? Right now, we're in the midst of a campaign to shut down a local airport, a recreational airport, just because, those spaces don't benefit our community, only benefiting a select few. And they're really dangerous as well. I'm not sure if you all remember that plane crash that unfortunately happened, I think last year. I think the 1-year anniversary just came by, but those spaces that aren't kind of talked about, and when there's a huge methane gas leak, where's that news coverage, or where's that global presence? And so I think the sources that we have to think about are the ones that aren't talked about, that are happening, that are just as important, right? That's just my 2 cents.
Is oil drilling still a problem?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is oil drilling still a problem?
It certainly depends on which community you're in. You would have communities like Wilmington, some parts of Long Beach, Carson, Baldwin Hills, those areas where you actually do have situations where oil drilling sites are actually located directly underneath people's houses. And no, people don't always get the royalties for those drilling sites as well. So sometimes they have absolutely no benefit from them. It just depends on the legal situation regarding property rights, et cetera, that I'm frankly not as familiar with. But in any case, yes, so it is a problem, especially for those if you live near those, because oftentimes those sites can be, or can have, even the old abandoned wells, if they're not sealed correctly, it can cause smells and odors. But even if you live near an active one, sometimes those smells, those odors, when you smell something like that, it's because they have chemicals in them, and it's oftentimes those chemicals are not exactly good for health. So yeah, it is a problem. It's more of a localized problem, and I think what you're starting to see is a transition, and move away from this idea of air quality as a region and looking at air quality at the local neighborhood level. So you're not just saying, oh, air quality is improved overall in Southern California. I mean, yes, it's still the main bar, but it's like, what are people experiencing at the neighborhood level? What are they experiencing when you really dig into the weeds?
And so I hear a lot of talk about the problems. And so I kind of want to move the discussion into policy. And so what current policies are in the works at the local, state, or federal level that address air pollution?
Chris, did you want to go ahead?
I'll defer to you.
Okay. So I think, I have mentioned, that, we're right now we're really focused on bringing our region down to the federal ozone and PM standards. So, right now that's a big concentration on reducing nitrogen oxide emissions. So that's what we're moving towards. That was our focus of our last, what we call our air quality management plan, which is basically the blueprint of how our agency will come down to these federal levels. And that's also going to be the focus of our next air quality management plan, which is ongoing. Just a plug for the AQMP is, this is a great place for people to get involved, sit in on the meeting, see where, we're looking to go as an agency. And then, once again, we'll bring up mobile sources. So we need to figure out more zero emission technologies, how we are going to fund them, how we're going to incentivize them. And then, we brought up toxics a few times. I think, toxics is a very important issue, especially right for the communities that live right next to refineries, manufacturing plants, metal melting facilities and things like that. So as, in addition to continuing to look at our ozone and PM issues, South Coast AQMD also does have a suite of our toxic rules in order to minimize the cancer risk and health levels of, as we talk about the localized regions and areas of our communities.
Yeah, I think that right now there's a lot going on at all levels of government, and Rogelio might be better suited to talk about the local level. But in terms of at the federal, state, and I'll mention the air district level. So at the federal level, you have the administration, the Biden administration's Build Back Better plan, or Build Back Better Act, which is still being finalized and tends to take twists and turns every single day because that's just how Washington works. And I'm not, there's not 100% certain of what the current plan looks like. I know that because of a particular West Virginia senator, that the plan has gone through multiple revisions. So I'm not on top of exactly where the discussion is now. I'd also throw a certain Arizona senator into that discussion as part of the issue there. But in any case, I know that the Biden administration is prioritizing, at least verbally, environmental justice issues and really wanting to do some really bold work on climate. But there's still a lot of things moving in DC on that point. At the state level, we actually just finished up the legislative session, so there's not going to be a ton of new bills until the beginning of 2022. This was kind of a mixed year when it came to environmental issues in the legislature. You saw a number of bills that were friendly to electric vehicles get through, both in terms of like how they're charging equipment and the programs to help incentivize them. But then you have significant climate bills that really set big firm goals and deadlines and regulations being held. Some of the bigger bills, unfortunately, did not make it through. They could still come up next year, though. The State Air Resources Board, CARB, will actually be voting on its climate or its funding plan for clean transportation incentives. So that includes like the electric vehicle rebate programs that we have here, both the ones for the broader market, as well as the ones targeted towards disadvantaged and lower income communities. And a lot of people don't know about that program. It's called Clean Cars for All. At South Coast, it's called Replace Your Ride. So if you're looking for an EV and need help buying one, that might be an available program for you. And then at the air district level as well, you have on November 5th, the air district is considering a rule to require tighter pollution controls on oil refineries. And there are 16 facilities throughout the South Coast Basin that this affects. Most of them are in the harbor area, but that rule alone will actually be a significant step in meeting our air quality standard commitments. It won't get us there fully, but it will be a significant reduction and emission reduction, and will be most felt by those communities near oil refineries.
A couple things to highlight at the LA level. I think the mayor's office has been dealing out a lot of directives and goals for 2030 and 2035 to really kind of have more zero emission vehicles on the road. I believe they put out a directive either earlier this year or last year directing for the port to have 100% zero emission cargo handling equipment. So that would be all your cranes. And then for the truck fleet, which I believe only applied to the drayage truck fleet, to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. That would obviously impact the communities of Westminster and Western Long Beach and other areas directly adjacent to the port complex most significantly, but would obviously have impacts that kind of scaffold throughout the region, throughout our goods movement network. I believe the city also has directives, and you'll have to pardon or please fact check me, but it's your 2030 or 2035 for city fleets to be electric. And their bus fleet will also, the LADOT bus fleet will also be all electric by 2030 or 2035. Apologies, I keep, those two numbers are bungled up in my head. And then one recent program or pilot initiative that the city recently launched is their zero emission delivery zone, which I actually think Chris was at the presser event for that. I believe his organization was key in helping crafting the legislation. Our organization has been helpful in identifying partners or tech partners to kind of help monitor and enforce. But zero emission delivery zones are traditional yellow commercial loading areas, but they're focused or only accessible to zero emission delivery vehicles. So cargo bikes, people driving electric vehicles. And really the incentive or the purpose of that is to set aside really kind of prime space on the street or on the limited curb space, which has just become more and more sought after as we're seeing more mobility options out on the streets that have demand for it, and making kind of those prime parking spots accessible only to vehicles that are zero emission or all electric. And the goal there is to incentivize the big companies such as Amazon, FedEx, UPS to invest in their fleets so they can have access to prime parking spots so they can hit their deliveries on time and quickly. So that's something to look out for.
So are these policies enough? What kinds of policies should be introduced? Maybe if the answer is no, to better address some of these issues.
I guess I can answer if the policies are enough. As far as what I've seen reflected in our communities, right? I don't think it's benefiting our communities or going to our communities. They're really environmentally impacted. And I think a huge component of that is just the distrust we have towards government and higher officials. And so I think a big challenge we have is just how do we bridge that gap? Because historically, we haven't been given a reason to trust, government officials, and we don't have that trust established. And so I think that the policies that we're heading towards are really great, and I think that they are addressing the issues of air pollution, but I would love to see more policies directed towards environmentally impacted communities, because I feel like, those communities are the ones that are bearing the biggest burden, and how do we really direct policies towards them, right? Like, how do we get people to come to community meetings and have community input in what's being said, and, not having meetings at 3 p.m. when people are working. So it's tough. It's going to be a really big challenge reestablishing that trust and what that even looks like.
Yeah, I definitely want to agree with David on that. So there was a bill in 2017 called AB 617. And what AB 617 requires, among many other things, is for the Air Resources Board and the local air districts to identify the most among the most disadvantaged polluted communities in the state, and develop an emission reductions plan or monitoring plan for those communities. So I'm a member of the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach AB 617 Community Steering Committee, which was one of the year one communities. We've had 3 rounds of communities selected for it. In total, within South Coast, that's 6 communities, I want to say. Yeah, 6 communities. And it's well, to get directly to the question, I think no, it's certainly not enough. We still need to meet attainment of those air quality standards, and we still have disparate impacts. And those impacts are most oftentimes fall on our most vulnerable residents. So there's still a lot more that needs to be done. But I really do want to emphasize and agree with what David was mentioning, what you have more community ownership of this process. I know for the AB 617 process, which is now kind of being retooled a little bit, one of the things that many of the community folks have expressed is that distrust. And I think really having more community control and ownership of how AB 617 works and other similar initiatives work is going to be very important in regaining that trust and actually being able to show and demonstrate and help the community reduce those emissions that are impacting them every day.
Yeah, I think both Chris and David bring up a real great point about our communities and getting involved. I think, if you come to any of our actual rural development processes, they tend to be our businesses, they tend to be coalitions, and not often is it our communities that come and speak. So I think, getting involved in the process itself, making your voice and your concerns heard is a great way to impact the rural development process. Chris mentioned AB 617, that is, geared so that it is a community-driven process. So, get involved in those meetings, try to get put on the steering committees. But I just urge everyone to get involved, to make their voices heard, to be educated on the issues that are concerning you, our communities, and what's happening regionally at the state and at the federal levels.
And so I want everybody to answer this one. I'm really excited about this question. So what is your recommendation on how people can take personal action to help in the fight for cleaner air?
All right, I will kick this one off. I, as Nathan mentioned, am a chemist, so I am obviously a true believer in the sciences. And as you guys are all going through your schooling, I think, get involved in the sciences, get involved in the engineering, the environmental sciences, be that next generation that's coming up with our infrastructure plans, our zero emission vehicles, cleaner technology so that we're not dependent on, our, non-renewable sources. Okay, so that's a very big, lofty goal, but just a big plug for the sciences and, how you can change it to impact our air quality or all our environmental issues in general.
I can jump in next and just encourage. I think a lot of our policy making is still made in an antiquated way where most of our policy process still rely on old, antiquated engagement approaches that benefit certain populations, typically older, whiter, wealthier, that have the time to go to meetings at 3 o'clock, like David mentioned. So speak out, follow and submit. I think if there's one benefit or one positive that came out of policy making over the last year and a half is really the reliance or the fact that governments have identified the need to really employ different types of technology to engage with community members, whether it's Zoom or written feedback, and use that to inform policymaking. So really just getting involved in demanding that policies incorporate feedback of broader communities is really important. And then also advocating for policies that at the end of the day, oftentimes kind of bring to question this idea of convenience versus greater community benefit. Policies such as congestion pricing or infrastructure decisions that prioritize multimodal transportation options such as bicycling or better transit inconvenience a specific type of the population, the people that are wealthier and that are accustomed to the infrastructure serving them the best. And I think we just need more people advocating for things that look at impacts holistically and benefit the greater good rather than an individual operating in the system.
Yeah, I think this would also be a good opportunity to point out things like California Clean Air Day that we sponsored or created this last, actually now this is the 4th year of the event. And this last one that we had on October 6th was the largest yet. And basically what we do is we encourage people to take individual actions to reduce air pollution, really educating folks about why air pollution is still an important issue. So people can engage in simple things all the way from, not using harmful cleaners, which have VOCs in them, which contribute to smog, all the way up to taking transit. I've actually been a longtime transit user since the years I was in Sacramento. I used transit pre-COVID when I was in working up the office in LA. I would take transit. So encouraging people to drive less is always an option. Also encouraging people to drive cleaner vehicles, and as over time you're going to see the transition towards zero emission vehicles really taking hold. So really using opportunities to engage people in easy to understand, easy to undertake ways to really emphasize the importance of air pollution and air quality I think is important. Now, with that said, I know the idea or concept of, well, if you just do this, everything will be fixed. We're not advocating for that. We know that it's going to take policy change as well. And that's why we continue to engage at the policy level as clean air advocates. And I think really what's important there, an important aspect is if you're just an average person, is again, going to these meetings if you can, writing to your elected officials, your appointed officials, and saying, hey, I'm not a policy expert. I don't have, I may not be aware of all the lingo, but clean air is something I agree about, or clean air is something I am concerned about. And because what they want to know is whether or not what their constituents are worried about, what is motivating their constituents to vote. And if they hear at these meetings industry, lining up of 50 to 100 people all for one point, but they don't hear a counter to that, a genuine counter from folks in the community or from community organizations or advocates like mine, it does not bode well. There's an old saying in politics: if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And so really being part of that discussion, make sure that you're always at the table, I think is going to be important. So changing your own practices, of course, helps, but also being part of that process.
And I just kind of want to add to, a few things that have been said, for South Coast AQMD, and as we do go through our rulemaking process, as we do go through our public process for our air quality management plan, for the AB 617 communities, we do take a serious role in making sure that, our stakeholders are heard, whether, like Chris said, it's the businesses or whether it's the community or whether it's certain coalitions. So, if you speak up, South Coast AQMD commits to listening to, your public comment and taking it seriously.
I think one thing that we could all do, right? Everyone sitting in this meeting to fight for clean air is just get connected with your community and knowing that there's huge power in numbers. I know it's crazy to think that, I could go against like a huge institution and actually win, but you can. And, I really do mean it when I say that you all are the experts of your own experience. So let that sink in and really think about that. You don't need to have some huge distinctive title to make a huge difference in your community. Break some rules, don't take no for an answer, just go for it. And really the world is yours. So have that, in mind, lead with your heart and really advocate for your community, because your community is going to be there for you in your victories, your losses, and throughout everything. So build your coalition with your community and get connected. I think that's a really huge way that you can achieve or fight for cleaner air.
We need those advocates. We need those voices to be heard, absolutely. I did want to, I'm not sure if I mentioned, and I apologize, but we do have an opportunity for audience questions. So I'll ask one more question, but before I do, I just want to put it in all your minds. Just if you do have questions, we will be moving to that very shortly. So just be kind of brainstorming through that, something you might want to ask to one of our panelists. But before we get to that, I just want to give an opportunity to all of our panelists to maybe plug your organization or maybe another organization, I don't know, something where if in hearing this conversation, maybe we are inspired to take action and to get involved. And is there an opportunity to do so with your organization or maybe touch on one of a meeting coming up or something?
Yeah, so 2 real quick plugs. I mentioned that refinery rule that's coming up on November 5th. That's going to be a very important rule. They're also considering, the South Coast AQMD is also considering how to get emission reductions from the ports. And I saw a port related question in there that maybe we can get to in a little bit. The many in the board, the AQMD board want to go with a memorandum of understanding, a voluntary agreement with the ports. The environmental advocates have a different idea and would like to see an actual rule put in place. Certainly happy to talk more about that. But I think more in another port-related issue that's going to be equally important too, that just actually came up last week, and the LA Times had an excellent editorial about it, is a number of industry groups actually sent a letter to the governor asking him to suspend labor and environmental rules to address the port backlog. And some of these rules are not in effect yet or don't even really affect the ports. So this actually has the potential to be a big brewing battle. So if there's anything between the refinery rule and this letter that industry sent to the governor, I think those are 2 good opportunities to speak up on.
I think for myself, I first just want to say that, I'm amazed by y'all. I love your enthusiasm. I love your commitment to the sustainability and air pollution. I think back to when I was in college and, none of these were on the top of my mind. So I definitely salute you for your passion and, you all amaze me. But I think I'll just echo what Chris says. And please get involved in the rural development process. Please get involved in, any public process that AQMD has. And I think also, your local government, your local officials, I think that's another great place to have your voice heard. You are their constituents and they should be listening to you. So, if you have any questions and, sorry, one more thing is I know AQMD has a great intern program. I think it's a great opportunity for students that want to learn more about AQMD to get involved. If you have any questions, I think Nathan has my contact information and I'm more than happy to help out where I can.
I would just add, kind of support your local community-based organizations as well as getting involved in your local communities. Local community-based organizations often have done a lot of the groundwork for getting the ear of local policymakers, either at the staff level or at the city council level, and they're in a position to kind of really push for change. Pacoima Beautiful, where David works, is an awesome organization. People for Mobility Justice is a great one. Another one that's really topical to our conversation today is East Yard Communities. Oh gosh, what is their name? East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. They've done a lot of work in the East LA, all the way down to the Gateway Cities area, just really advocating against larger factories in Vernon or against the port. Or fighting the freeway expansion of the 710. So there's a lot of organizations that are clued in and could use your support either as volunteers, as supporters, or otherwise.
Yeah, and some ways you can become involved with Pacoima Beautiful. We have a coalition of youth actually that lead this movement, but we're really looking for community inspectors. So if you're living in the Northeast Valley or just interested about learning about environmental justice and really being on the field, we do a lot of soil sampling, a lot of outreach, a lot of door knocking events. So we're really out on the field and we're really looking for students to come join us in this effort. We've been blessed to work with CSUN through Kimberly. And so really want to encourage anyone who's interested in working with environmental justice organizations like ours to hit me up, right? And let's go door knocking. Let's go outreach to our communities and teach them about what's happening in our environment. So, I'll link my email in the chat below. If anyone's interested in emailing me, learning more about our organization, you can reach out to me.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists, for your time. And we do want to move into a time of audience questions to wrap up. And so audience members, this is a time for you. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute, or if you're not comfortable doing so, the chat feature is available as well. Where can you find this recording? So it'll be posted to the Institute's website. I believe it was somebody already posted it in the chat. There you go. Oh, no, that's not it. Oh, wait, yes, that is it. YouTube channel.
So there was, I was going to say, there was one question earlier about whether or not South Coast AQMD has any regulations for cargo ships. So actually CARB, the California Air Resources Board, does, and they have a couple of different rules. One is when they're within California waters, they have to shift from bunker fuel, which is a very low grade dirty fuel, to using diesel, so that it's less polluting. Still polluting, but less polluting. So that is one regulation. The other thing also is that they have a rule that's called the at berth regulation. And what that means is that when the vessel is actually in the harbor at the berth it's assigned to, if it's capable of doing it, it has to plug into the electrical grid so it doesn't have to run off of its engines to generate electricity. So those are two rules that CARB has. It's very challenging to regulate ocean-going vessels because they are oftentimes registered in other countries, and so they are often, most of they're really stuck to or regulated by the country that they're registered under. So it is a very difficult challenge to regulate those, but there are a few things. Another thing that is done is an incentive program to reduce speeds while they're in the region, the vessel speed reduction program. They actually give financial incentives to those recognition to those shippers that voluntarily reduce their speed, because not only does it actually reduce pollution, but it also protects wildlife like whales, things like that.
And just to add on to that, and I think Chris actually just mentioned it earlier, South Coast AQMD is working on what we call an indirect source rule, since we do not have direct jurisdiction over cargo ships, but we're working on an indirect source rule for cargo ships. And then just to mention, as I've been saying, let's get involved. AQMD on our webpage does have what we call a sign up list, where you can sign up for all the different topics you're interested in, and you'll be getting emails about when certain working group meetings are and community meetings, and when certain things are brought to our governing board. So there's one place you can go to sign up for all this information.
I had a question, if I can chime in.
Absolutely, go for it.
Oh, thank you. What do you guys think are any thoughts on the prospects for using changes in land use zoning laws to get polluting industries and firms away from low-income minority communities? Because as I understand it, you'd have to come up against the city or the county who are responsible for zoning laws. And do you think there's is there much potential there kind of as a policy to alleviate the problem?
So I'll try to answer the question as best as I can. I'm not too familiar with what zoning laws look like, just because I haven't experienced those in my community. But I'm so for the movement of, you know, getting rid of like these polluting industries and environmentally impacted communities and replacing it with whatever the community needs, right? And having that be a community driven process. So yeah, I'm for, you know, the community taking ownership of what they want to see in their community. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Just to add to what David said, I'm trying to remember the bulk of my planning law class from 5 years ago or so. I think the biggest challenge there, or with zoning in general, is that whatever existing land use is present is typically grandfathered in. So even if, say, you know, the really industrial corner of downtown LA, where a lot of the wholesale produce, just wholesale company activity happens, was to be rezoned, the change wouldn't happen until there was a change of hands of property, or the property was going to be redeveloped. And I think that the legal challenges to exile or remove companies that are in operation now would be pretty tumultuous and probably a huge barrier. So I think right now our best approach is regulating them and imposing new markers or guidelines to hit targets for cleaner and cleaner operations. But Christopher or Uyen might know better.
Yeah, thanks, Rogelio. I was actually just going to mention that this is not quite zoning laws, but you know, a lot of South Coast AQMD toxics rules are based on health effects. And as we've mentioned earlier, you know, those that feel the greatest impact from a certain facility are those that are closest to that facility. So we can impose stricter standards on those communities. And then we also have what we call our AB 2588 program, our Toxics Hotspots Act to the state of California, where if a facility imposes certain risk thresholds to their community, it you know, depending on the level that you exceed that public risk threshold, you either have to notify your community, you have to take certain actions to reduce that risk. So once again, not necessarily zoning, but you know, there are some considerations that South Coast AQMD takes when looking at what a facility is emitting and how it affects their community and the closest sensitive receptor.
Well, thank you.
We had a question in the chat from Inez. So there's a lot of regulations in place, they just aren't followed. So how can we instill rules that would actually be followed and regulated, I guess?
That is a fun question. So I don't want to certainly disparage the work of South Coast AQMD. They do have a lot of work, or the California Air Resources Board. I think actually kind of the question right before that about how I think that they're talking about regulating the switching out from bunker fuel to diesel. I think so I know much earlier, there was a thing about getting a response from South Coast AQMD. So my understanding, in Uyen-Uyen, you can correct me on this, to get a more immediate response, you had 3 separate complaints on the cut smog line, right?
It's actually 6.
6, okay. So if you get 6 complaints on the cut smog line, you'll get you will get a immediate or an expedited response. I'll put it that way, an expedited response. So if you encounter a future situation where you have a chronic ongoing air pollution issue, that just keep that in mind, and then also know that air pollution can oftentimes be transient, and the air pollution you're experiencing in the moment may not be there by the time the regulator comes out. So it's difficult. Just to be perfectly honest, I think one of the biggest things is making sure that if you are part of an effort to get a rule across the board, is that you are part of the implementation process as well, and that you are asking the implementing agency, the city council, the city government entity, whatever, you're asking whoever's carrying out that rule to remain consistent to whatever promises were made before, making sure that they are saying that they are following the the letter and both the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and really pushing that conversation forward. As far as like the prior question about how does somebody regulate something like that, I think specific to that bunker fuel issue, but also generally, South Coast AQMD and CARB do a lot of testing and a lot of data gathering, and a lot of this data is available online. I don't know specifically about bunker fuel, but looks, I was just doing a Google search on the side. It looks like that they do emission testing for the ships when they're at the berth. I'm not an expert in that particular field, so don't take it as gospel. But certainly, I think being able also to use the data that AQMD and CARB collects as part of your argument is helpful too. And one last point. So I mentioned earlier that AB 617 process. So that community emission reduction plan, it's just a plan unless if you actually have the agencies and the cities, specifically the cities actually participating and understanding that process, because when they go into things like land use and they do something that is not consistent with the 617 community emissions reduction plan, you can go back and say, hey, you guys aren't, this is not following up on the promise that was made to us, and you're able to highlight that. I know I've talked with the city of Long Beach multiple times about the need to incorporate AB 617 into their planning documents, and to their credit, they have. So I think that's a small little victory of getting that effort recognized and planned around as the city moves forward.
Just to jump in real quick, if I'm talking too much, other panelists, please feel free to shut me up. But to the point of the 1-800-CUT-SMOG, that's the number where you make the complaints. Like I mentioned, it's 6 complaints to elevate it to what we call a public nuisance. We do have more than 100 inspectors that address our complaints and ensure compliance with our rules. And then, to the point of getting involved in all of these different meetings and things, I think as a rule writer, when I am imagining up all these great emission reductions and how we're going to get our basin into, less ozone, less NOx, and fewer toxics, I have all these grand ideas, but at the end of the day, I need to know whether or not it's feasible, right? And so who knows what's actually feasible for your community? That would be the community itself. I might think that you have, a dust issue, but really you have, a VOC issue. So that's why it is very important for our community involved, so that you point the district and the regulators and, compliance staff in what we need to look at, and how it can actually be done without, unintended consequences.
Thank you so much.
We had a more specific question from earlier. There's an asphalt plant that burns along the Pacoima Wash various days of the week. As a resident of San Fernando, the city cannot do anything because the plant is in the city of Los Angeles. I have called in the past and there was no follow-up from AQMD. What can we do to mitigate this toxic air? It happens on Sunday mornings, on school days. It's across from a public park.
Yeah, I can just jump in, right? People who live in the Northeast Valley, Pacoima, San Fernando, we know there's so many different pollutants in our area. And sometimes they're all firing off at once and you're like, who do you turn to, right? And that's one of the realities of living in our communities. Not that connection to these different organizations or places to really say, hey, this is polluting our air, right? There's maybe not a lot of maybe awareness of how do I approach that. I mean, we're going against these really like long, deeply rooted institutions, and how do they maintain power, right? It's through generations of, historically ignoring our communities. And so that's how they build power. That's how they sustain there. And so I relate. I grew up in the Northeast Valley. I understand what it's like to live across like these really heavy polluters and not feeling like you can do anything. And I think that's the beauty in understanding, like, you don't have to go through all the bureaucracy of things sometimes. Sometimes you can just organize yourself. And it's one of the unfortunate realities of living in LA, right? Sometimes our communities are ignored, but that doesn't mean that you have to ignore your community. Organizing, getting involved with, Pacoima Beautiful, we have a lot of resources that we can provide to you. If you just call our office, be like, hey, this is polluting. We're like, all right, we'll work with you. Let's get something done. So know that you do have a partner. You're not just alone, and you don't have to rely on all these different institutions to get a problem solved. You can look to your community as well.
As far as the South Coast AQMD responding, I'm not sure what happened, however many years ago, but, please call 1-800-CUT-SMOG, please register your complaint. Like I mentioned earlier, if enough complaints are put in, it becomes what we call public nuisance. There's currently not an odor rule for asphalt plants, but we do have a nitrogen dioxide rule, but we do respond to odor complaints and visible emission complaints. So, if the complaint gets risen, an inspector will go out and they'll go ahead and try to figure out the source of the problem and go from there.
Do our panelists, would you mind your emails being shared in the chat? Very cool. I will post that in a second. So we have about 5 minutes left. And so any last minute questions from anybody?
Yeah, actually, I have a question.
Go for it.
Are there any mass surveillance systems in place, like in California, to really see what's in our air or anything like that for the community to see?
As far as South Coast AQMD, we do have a huge network of monitors. You can see the live day-to-day or maybe hourly data on our website. And then every few years we do, Chris mentioned it earlier, a toxic study, and we come up with a huge report from that. You can find that on our website also.
Yeah, and in addition to the monitoring that AQMD does, so there's a rule that requires refineries to do fence line monitoring, and I think that's also been applied to other types of facilities that have persistent air quality problems as well. So that is, so there's that. There's also what's called community air monitoring programs, which basically are little low-cost sensors that are deployed at the community level. Coalition for Clean Air, we've installed about 200 of these. They're particulate sensor monitors, so when you're looking for things like toxics or gases, things like that, those sensors aren't designed to pick up those pollutants, but what it's looking at is particulates, and specifically PM 2.5 and PM 10. So it's so they have their limits, and they're also not used for regulatory purposes, but more for community education. So they're not a panacea, they're not a silver bullet, but really just designed to make people better understand what their air quality is at the neighborhood level. But so that's in addition to the reference monitoring, the EPA reference monitoring that the agencies do.
Sorry, I just had a follow-up question to that regarding like the campsites. Do you think it'll ever be used for regulatory purposes or like to track toxic substances? I don't know if the technology is there yet, but it seems very interesting to like for the future.
The what site?
The community air monitoring sites.
Oh, yeah. So that is there are a couple different vendors out there. We actually have we include the live map of this data online on our website at ccair.org. There's a community air monitoring section on our website that you can look at. There's one called Air Visual, and then there is another one called Purple Air. The monitors that we are deploying are the Purple Air monitors, but there's like other companies that do air quality monitoring. There's not I think right now the agencies are kind of looking at how to best use that air quality monitoring data, just because it isn't up to that reference standard that EPA sets, which I understand. You want to make sure you're making decisions off of good data. So right now we're really trying to figure out how to best use that information. Most of it, again, is focused more on the community level and flagging things for regulators for additional research and investigation.
Yeah, so just to some things that Chris mentioned, the two overarching monitoring rules South Coast has is Rule 1180 and Rule 1480. And then, with all these new low-cost sensors coming out, AQMD does have a program where we are evaluating what we call these low-cost air quality sensors, so we can get data on. I believe they're trying to network all the data and see, what the data tells us from there. And then additionally, they're assessing which types of these low-cost sensors are better than others and things like that. So that's another good program to look into.
Well, I think that's gonna about do it for this event. Thank you so much to our panelists for coming, and to all of you students and faculty who joined us today and taking some time to learn about air pollution and how it's affecting our communities, and what kind of policies are involved, why it's important and why you should care. And because hopefully if you've gained anything from this conversation, it is important and it is still a problem that needs to be addressed. And so thank you everybody for coming. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And I encourage you to check out or reach out to one of our panelists, or at least check out their organization. And also thank you to the Institute for Sustainability for allowing us to put on this event as well. And happy Sustainability Day, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. I think that does it. What do you think, Professor?
I thought it was really good. Great job, you guys. Great job. How do you feel?
I feel good. Thought we had some great discussion going, and I'm glad. We're just thankful for the opportunity, and yeah.
Me too. I'm so happy with how it went. Really, really stunned. Everything went really great.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, we can debrief more in our next meeting if you'd like, but I just want to congratulate you all, and I think it went really well, and I'm really, really proud of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.